Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Beyond the Binary, a guide to understanding gender diversity. I'm your host, Sharona Summer, the National Director of Learning and Development at CIP. Founded in 1984, CIP is one of the most comprehensive programs for assisting young adults with learning differences to succeed in college, employment, and independent living. Our mission is to inspire independence and expand the foundation on which young adults on the autism spectrum, ADHD, and other learning differences can build happy and productive lives. We're so excited to be able to present this very relevant topic for you today. Although this webinar will not focus on gender identity within the autism community specifically, it's important to note that there are current studies that report 22.5% of transgender individuals have existing ASD diagnoses, and up to 15% of autistic adults report a transgender identity. So this is a very relevant, important topic. And with that, I'm very proud to introduce our speaker for today. Susan Knoppow is the parent of 2 non-binary children and the CEO of WOW Writing Workshop, a Michigan-based company that leads the college admissions industry with their unique approach to the college application essay. Focused, incisive, and creative, Susan can turn the most daunting writing challenge into a series of simple steps. She conceptualized and developed the WOW method for teaching writing. A former executive speechwriter and copywriter, Susan's also a published poet and essayist and holds a BA in psychology from the University of Michigan and an MFA in writing from Vermont College. Welcome, Susan, and thank you.
Thanks, Sharona. It's so good to be here with all of you today. This is really a pleasure, and I'm glad you asked me to do this presentation. So by way of introduction, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about gender. We're going to be really going back to the basics, but the basics have changed a little bit. And so that makes this conversation very important, because some of the things that we think about when we maybe think about gender are not always what the young people in our lives think of when they think about gender. So let me give you my story. I'm a mom. I have 3 children. I am a writer. I would consider myself an ally. That's a word that kind of goes in and out of vogue. So what I mean by that is that I am an advocate for and a supporter of my children and queer folks in general, as much as I can be. I'm a member of many different communities. So I'm an educator. I work with students who are applying to college. That's my day job, WOW Writing Workshop. And I'm part of my religious community. I'm part of my town community. I'm part of part of writers' communities. And everywhere I go, I represent all parts of myself and my family. I am, like I said, an essay coach and an educator. So I care a lot about young people and how they move through the world. I write about this on my blog, which is the second link there if you're interested. Don't look at it now, but you're welcome to copy it, or you can follow up with me later and I can send it to you. But I write a lot about this. I write a lot about, from a parent's perspective, what I've experienced and what that means for me and for my family. So I don't pretend to speak for queer youth. I would never, ever pretend to speak for anybody else. I speak for myself, I speak from my own experience, and I speak from a parent's perspective. So let me give you my way back story. Like Sharona said, I have 2 children who identify as transgender, non-binary, and I'll explain what that means in more detail in a moment. My oldest child, Miriam, is a senior at the University of Michigan right now, and way back, when Miriam, who uses the pronouns they and them, I'll talk more about that also, was 14, we were in our car, our minivan, sitting in the driveway, and we were having this conversation. Miriam had just come back from a youth group weekend spent with a bunch of new friends, and said, "Mom, something, I don't know how this came up in the conversation, gender is on a spectrum." And I, being a very, progressive, liberal mom, said, "Oh no, sweetie, sexuality is on a spectrum, is on a continuum. You can be straight, you can be gay, you can be a lot of different things in between, but gender is male or female." And Miriam looked at me, because I was the dumb mom, because they were 14 and I was the grown up. "No, Mom, you're wrong." So I thought, wow, I don't even know what they're talking about. So I went and looked it up. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is a thing. I didn't know. So one of the things I learned right there at that moment in that little bit of research I was doing was, instead of saying no, we can say, I didn't know that, or I need to learn more about that. And as for those of you who are parents and educators and counselors, this is probably an experience you've had. We want to say no because it's not what we are familiar with, but we could be wrong. We could be out of date. So that was the beginning. Miriam identified at the time as gay, and by the age of 18 had come out as non-binary and said, I am neither male nor female. So I'm not male. I'm not, Miriam was assigned female at birth, thus the name. I am not male, but I'm not female. I'm something else. And I thought, oh, well, okay then. I still don't totally understand this. I'm still not entirely sure, but okay, I can go with it, right? We'll go with it. I'm the kind of parent who can deal with this. And I'm, thinking I feel good about it. So I thought, I started looking for things to read and learn, and I couldn't find anything that was written for parents. There was a lot from young people, but nothing that was written for people like me who said, I want to be supportive, but I'm not really sure how. I don't know exactly what that means. So 4 years later, child number 3 tells me, I want to use they and them pronouns. This is my youngest child, who is now 16. And I have a new name, and I'm not going to use my old name. I'm using my new name. And again, my husband and I are like, okay, we got this. We understand. Except in this case, my youngest, over the past year or so, has said, I'm trans feminine. I'll explain what that means also. So I thought, I get this, right? I've been through this before. I can handle it. But it wasn't the same. It's not always the same. And so for child number 3, it's a different kind of journey. The lesson for me and for all of us is to listen. So for some of you, this will be familiar. How many of you seen this before?
Susan, there's no sound on the video.
So it sounds like we're having some trouble with the sound on the video, so I'm not going to, unfortunately, I can't play it for you perfectly, but for those of you who remember Free to Be You and Me, when this came out in 1972, it was ahead of its time. It was a big deal. It was very progressive. It was very open. And it's what we learned about gender. I'm in my 50s, and I'm sure some of you are around my age. Some of you are probably older than me. Some of you are probably younger than me. And at the time, what we thought of when we thought of gender, we thought of gender equity. We thought of equality. We thought of opportunity. But since then, this story of these cute little babies saying, well, I think I'm a girl, dainty feet, I'm cute. And the other one says, you're bald, you must be a boy. And then they check, they look underneath their little nightgowns and say, oh, wait a minute, no, we were wrong. The story there was, you can't be sure, you can't tell a book by its cover, da 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 da. But the point was that you can't be sure just by looking at someone what gender you can't just tell by looking at them what gender activities they will be able to participate in. Now we talk about gender identity, which is a little different. Now, when I talk to my kids, they think we're overdoing it, talking about this so much. They think it's like enough already, you know, what's the big deal? When I talk to my parents and people their age, they're totally confused. When I talk to my friends, many of whom are having experiences like this with their own children, they want to explore more. So what I want to do here today is I want to help you understand some key terms. And I want to talk about how gender and sexuality are not the same thing. I want to help you have some insight into how we can help young people feel more comfortable so that gender identity doesn't become an obstacle in our relationships and their relationships with other adults. I want to look at how they might share information about their gender journey, and depending on our role in their lives, how we might be able to participate in that. And also give you some ideas for how to get more information. I want to say now, often when I do this presentation live, it's very interactive. I'm walking around a room, I'm looking at faces, I can see confusion or people want to ask things. I encourage you, although we're not going to do it that way, I'm going to save a lot of time for questions at the end. I would like you to write them into the question or chat window as you go along. So if you think of something that's confusing to you, you don't understand it, it contradicts what you think you knew, it makes you think of something else, please make a note. Sharona is going to moderate questions at the end. I will answer as many as I can. And if I don't get your question today, I promise to follow up. I always follow up. So, like I said, you can ask me anything. And I'm going to get into that a little bit about what does it mean to be an ally and to engage with the larger community, because you can't ask my kid anything you want. There are things that are inappropriate and invasive, but you can ask me, and there's a difference. So first, let's look at key terms. Let's make sure we're all on the same page, having the same conversation, and how gender is different from sexuality. So like I said, when I looked at the Free to Be You and Me video, in the past, we talked about gender roles and gender equality, men and women in the workplace, that kind of thing. In the present, we're looking at gender identity, who I am, not just what I do. In the future, who knows? So your assigned gender is your sex, your biological sex. They'll say that you're assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth. It's sort of a technical term, but it's a way of talking about, so we don't say, oh, he was a boy and now he's a girl. No, she is a girl. She was assigned male at birth. She is female. It can be a little confusing. Like, how does that happen? Well, what people will say is, I didn't identify as female then. I identified as male, but I've always been female. It's not for us to question, it's for us to respect and be comfortable enough and familiar enough with terms. Our youth have a language for exploring and questioning gender. They do. And often when we're older people, older generations, we don't have that language. So some of the subtleties may feel like splitting hairs to us. Well, it's hard for me. I mean, I had a friend say to me, well, I've always thought of Miriam as a girl, so I'm just going to use she and her. And I said, no, it's not okay. It doesn't matter that I know who you're talking about. They use they and them pronouns. They identify as non-binary. And we, in our conversations, whether they're here or not, are going to use those words, because that shows an openness and respect. And this wasn't an disrespecting person. This wasn't a person who meant to be rude. He just found it difficult to have the conversation. So question, and again, if you were in a room with me, I'd ask you to raise your hand and tell me, but how many of you who have children had preconceptions about who your children would be when they were born or when they were small? You thought, oh, I understand them, I get them, I know how they're going to be. And how many of us are right about some things, but we're surprised about others? I think I can confidently say that we've all been surprised. So this is one of those areas where sometimes we're surprised. We don't say, well, you used to wear pink and like sparkly shoes, so what do you mean you're not really a girl? The way people identify is as they identify. We have a responsibility to grapple with this, because for the future, what we believe now isn't what's going to be important. What our young people are teaching us is what's most important. So, like I said, gender is who I am. Sexual orientation is who I am attracted to. Gender is my identity. We would never tell anyone you are not whatever other identity they have. You know, I am this person. I am this kind of person. We wouldn't tell them, no, you're not. We would say, tell me more about that. I want to learn about that. Sexual orientation is who I am attracted to. So when we think of, gay or straight, that's sexual orientation. When we talk about cisgender or transgender, that's gender identity. So the assigned gender, like I said, the gender a baby's given on birth, very simple. Gender identity is how we feel about our gender in our hearts and our minds. Gender expression or presentation is how we show our gender to the world. So how we dress, how we wear our hair, the way we behave, they don't always match. See, gender identity, assigned gender, gender expression, they don't all have to match, which can be confusing sometimes. But again, if it's confusing, go with it. Ask, be open. Cisgender describes a person whose birth sex, their assigned gender, and their gender identity line up. Transgender is someone whose gender identity and birth sex don't align. They don't match. So I have male, physically I am male, but I identify as female, or physically I am female. I have female biological parts, but I identify as male. This can seem confusing. Well, what's sex? What's gender? Aren't they the same? We've talked about them as the same. Actually not. Again, it may seem like splitting hairs, but these are important distinctions. Not expecting anybody to become an expert overnight. The reason I point all these things out is because you will hear things that might seem confusing. And it's okay to be confused. It's really okay. So when we say, there's other words, birth sex, biological sex, this is the genetic, chemical, anatomical characteristics. This is, does the baby have a penis, yes or no? That is birth sex, biological sex. But that does not necessarily dictate gender. We equate it. We often will equate it. There are even parents now, you might know some, who are raising their children without binary gender. They're not saying the baby's male or female. They're saying the baby is a baby. It's not everywhere, but it is happening. You will come across this at some point in your life, most likely. Gender queer is a term that some people use to broadly describe that they don't identify as male or female. You might hear trans feminine or trans masculine, which is perhaps not saying I am female, but I am transgender and I lean toward feminine, a feminine identity or a masculine identity. What's interesting about this is it almost plays into the binary by being non-binary. So again, there's a lot of conversation going on, and it's our job as a supportive people in our young people's lives to be there for them and to listen and pay attention. This is important too. In the past, being transgender was considered something off. And this is just from a couple of years ago when the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a statement saying variations in gender identity and expression are normal aspects of human diversity. Mental health problems in these children arise from stigma and negative experiences. So it is not a mental illness to identify as transgender, or if you could just overcome your depression, you wouldn't think you were trans anymore. No. The mental health problems in these children arise from stigma and negative experiences and can be prevented by a supportive family and environment, including health care. Just because they're not very common doesn't mean they're abnormal. So using normal, abnormal, try to get that out of your vocabulary if possible. the Dr. Bruner, who was quoted in this American Academy of Pediatrics statement, said, he said, colleagues look at me askance and say, isn't this something they grow out of? I was taught that in medical school. And he says, so was I. It's incorrect. I just found that statement to be so powerful. Yes, this is what we learned. Oh, they'll grow out of it. Oh, it's a phase. Oh, it's just something they're experimenting with. Don't take it too seriously. No. When your kid comes to you and says, I am a different gender, you take that seriously. When your student tells you this, when someone you're counseling tells you this, you take them seriously. You don't tell them you'll grow out of it. I mean, imagine being a kid and having this really challenging thing to share and then have someone say, whatever, you'll grow out of it. We'll talk about it in a couple of years. No, no, no. They need support. They need positive reinforcement. They need an environment where they can be themselves for any child at any point in their development. So just think how important it is related to gender. So how can we help people feel more comfortable so that this doesn't become an obstacle? Well, because youth tend to have language that's ahead of many adults. They're confident about these issues. Their knowledge is available to them. They know how to find it. They're less isolated. There's communities online, in person, for LGBTQ plus. There's a lot of other words that we can put at the end. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. There's a lot of other pieces of this acronym. So sometimes we'll just use the word plus. Older generations, I would include myself from years ago, and some of my friends fear getting it wrong. Oh, I'm gonna get it wrong. I don't know what to do. And they shut down. It's okay. As Miriam, my oldest, the 22-year-old will say, I don't care if you get it wrong. I just want you to try. And if I correct you, I don't want you to be mad at me for correcting you. And I'd like you to get it right eventually. I'd like you to practice. So what we're looking for is an affirming common language. So what's the common language? Well, one rule of thumb, use adjectives, not nouns. So not Jamie is a queer or Jamie is a transgender. No. Jamie is gay. Jamie is queer. Jamie is transgender. Jamie is my transgender child. Julia is my queer friend. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily identify that way, but using adjectives. You are not a transgender. You are transgender. It's a part of your identity. So these are some words also that have sort of, words come in and out of use and in and out of comfort. We say gay because homosexual came from a medical it was a medical term, and it has negative connotations. We don't say that they were born male or female. We say they were assigned male or female. Some adult decided that's a girl. They weren't born a girl and became a boy. They were assigned female and realized later in life that they identified as male. We used to say the opposite sexes or both genders. No, there's many genders, all genders, because both or opposite suggest a binary. In my presentation, we call it beyond the binary. We're getting beyond that. We don't say transgender people and normal people. We say transgender people and cisgender people. There's no normal, because if you're not normal, then you're abnormal, and that's stigmatizing. So people use different pronouns: she, her, and hers, he, him, and his, they, them, and their. If you get an email from me, you'll see under my name, it'll have my pronouns and a link to an article explaining what that means. Why do I do that? Because even though you would assume I was female, from my appearance, from my name, from the way I present myself, from my face, whatever, I don't want you to assume that about everybody. I want you to know that there are people who use different kinds of pronouns. There's even some unusual variations. I put them in the final bullet. And so if people use them, this is legitimate. They're just not as widely used. Now, people will say it's not grammatically correct to use they or them. Actually, many style manuals, many professional organizations are now accepting they and them as singular personal pronouns. And we can learn to hear things. You is used as a single pronoun and a plural pronoun. They is used as a single pronoun and a plural pronoun. And my guess is in a few years, the more people use it, the less unusual it will sound. Now, I want to talk for one moment about coming out, because especially if you're working with young people or they're your children or your students, coming out is not a thing that just happens. You don't just wake up one day and you're out. One thing about being part of a supportive community is understanding that coming out is constant. It happens all the time. People are walking out and learning, meeting new people who may not know about their gender identity. The question is always, who knows? Who's allowed to know? Who is told? Who have they told? Who are they comfortable having know? And when did they know? Because some people will say, well, you know, my child always identified as female. I mean, how can someone decide that they're transgender at age 14? People realize things about themselves at all different times in their lives. And this is perfectly reasonable that at any time someone can realize. I have a friend whose sister-in-law came out as a transgender woman 5 years ago in her 40s. She knew this about herself. She didn't really have a name for it. She didn't know what to do with it. And even when she felt like she had a name for it, she didn't feel comfortable being who she was. And she finally is and lives as a woman all the time. And what a life changer for her. Who's going to say to her, you can't do this now? Who's going to say to a 14-year-old, well, you never acted, you played with trucks and Legos when you were 7 and you always dressed like a boy. So what do you mean to tell me you're actually a girl, you're non-binary now that you're 13? We have to listen to our young people. So what are the implications for individuals? Well, we're looking at who someone is. We're looking at this matters to people. You know people who are non-binary. You may not know who they are. You know people who are transgender. And as I said, non-binary is like a version, a type of transgender, a category of being transgender. It's important for our youth to feel that they live their own truth and that we're respectful of their truth. What are the implications for families? Now, this gets complicated, right? Remember I said, how many of you have children or have worked with young people and made assumptions about them? I think I know something about her. I know what she's going to be like when she's older. Or, wow, what a girly, frilly. And then the child says 10 years later, I'm non-binary. And you're like, wait, you're the girliest girl I know. That's what we thought we knew. It's just like thinking we know things, about what their future career is going to be or what kind of people they're going to want to be with or what kind of friends they're going to have. So implications for families, we really need to upend our assumptions. Now, this goes to the extended family, grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, extended cousins. You go to a family wedding and there's 20 cousins you haven't seen in 3 years. We need to be able to share this information in families. When my children started identifying different from the gender they had been assigned, I sent out emails and texts and messages to my cousins all over the country, all over the world. And I said, I need you to know this. This is just a fact. It's important. It's a piece of my, it's like, you have a birth announcement. I had a baby. Well, guess what? Here's the thing you need to know about this child. Because it felt like I wanted it just to be a normal piece of information. I'm a writer. This is what I write about in my blog. So I had the advantage of being able to take an article and send the link out to everybody I knew. But it's important to normalize, to open communication, to tell relatives, it's okay to ask me, and not to judge, not to look at it and think, what's that about? Oh my God, poor you. I said, no. I told people up front, I don't need you to feel sorry for me. Nothing bad happened. Nobody died. I just have to adjust how I think about this, how I think about my child, some aspects. Look, from the very beginning, I would say to people, my kid is my kid. They're the same person they were before, just different gender identity, which has significant implications, but it doesn't mean that they don't still like the things they like, they don't do the things they did. What are the implications for schools and workplaces? This is important too. Again, upending assumptions, communication. We're sending our students excuse me, off to college. We're helping them move into the world of work. We're trying to help them live independently. They're going to go to grocery stores. They're going to go to the dry cleaner. They're going to make new friends. They're going to be out in the world. It's important to help that world feel more comfortable with all the folks who are coming in. So one of the things I talk a lot about when I talk to educators, and I've done this with people in schools and supplemental schools for different organizations, I say, the one thing you can do is start signaling. Your forms, your intake forms can have other options for gender. Not male, female, other, no. Male, female, non-binary, and a space. Or prefer not to share. That signals that you're paying attention. Having spaces for parent 1 and parent 2, not mother and father. Sibling 1, sibling 2, not sister and brother. One of my youngest is applying to college and was filling out an application, and it asked for how many siblings you have, and then the choices were sister and brother. Well, she has one brother and she has one non-binary sibling, and it was very upsetting not to see that as a choice. And I said, okay, here's what I do when I see son, daughter. It doesn't say child, child. So again, one of the things you can do if you have any control over the databases in your organizations, change those labels. If they're just labels, they can be changed. I know how databases work. You can go, in fact, I was talking to a friend who's a doctor, and she said, okay, what can I do to be more supportive? I said, well, you can offer a variety of courtesy titles, MX to go along with MR and MS. You can use, sibling 1, sibling 2, parent 1, parent 2. You can offer different gender options. It's important. This goes to the broader community as well, right? What can we do? Now, this is very, very important to me. This is a hierarchy that I try very hard to share as often as I possibly can. So for communities in general, whether the community is your larger family, your religious community, your school community, your work community, whatever the community is, there's dismissal. Dismissal is, that's not a real thing. I don't really like that. It's not real. That's ridiculous. This is like, you can't be transgender in the military. Like, really? You can pretend that you can't be. All you're doing is closeting people. It's not like trans people aren't going to be in the military. They're just not going to be out. That's dismissal. And that's hurtful. That damages everybody. There's tolerance. Tolerance is kind of don't ask, don't tell. Okay, I'm okay with it. I don't really want to talk about it. So kind of don't bring that to me. Keep that over there. You can be that, but be that over there. Go be with your people. I'm not going to hurt you, but you do that over there. I'll do my thing over here. Oh, and when you're with me, I don't want to talk about that. Acceptance is, okay, you can be trans, you can be non-binary, you can be queer in my house. You can come to my dinner table. You can be here with me. I accept you. Okay, that's comfortable. That's in my closed environment, in my school, in my home, in our building, in our classroom. That's the teacher who creates a comfortable environment. But the school overall doesn't really do it. Or the family where the nuclear family, absolutely fine, totally comfortable, but the grandparents, not so much. That's acceptance. I'll make you a comfortable little environment when I'm there to put my arms around you. Engagement is what I'm doing today. Engagement is making a point of making the world ready for my kids and other youth, people they haven't met yet. So engagement is me being in a lift on the way from the airport once a year or two ago when we were allowed to be in airports and go places and travel. And the driver, we're talking, we're chatting. It turns out we have kids about the same age. And she says, oh, well, what are your kids, boys or girls? And at the time, my youngest was still identifying as male. And I said, oh, I have 2 sons and my oldest is non-binary. And she said, oh, what does that mean? And I explained. She said, oh, one of my kids is gay. And I said, oh, ask your kid. She's about the same age. She'll know what I'm talking about. She'll explain more. Why did I do that? I am never going to see that driver ever again. I don't even know her name. I don't know who she is. Why did I do that? And I told her, I said, why would I tell you this? I'm never going to see you again. First of all, because I have no discomfort with that. I'm fine with it. And two, because she does know someone. She just doesn't know who it is yet. And when she meets that person, she's not going to say, what does that mean? Because she already said it to me. It doesn't hurt me. I want to educate her. I'm an ally. I want to engage. So this presentation, that's engagement. Me mentioning that to the Lyft driver, that's engagement. Me making sure when my kid is about to go, who's, can drive now by herself, calling ahead to the doctor's office and saying, remember, gender, female, her pronouns. I know that the legal name is this, that hasn't been changed yet, but this is the name that she uses. Please make sure, please remember. That's engagement. That's making the world a little tiny bit more comfortable, because most of the world doesn't get it. So how might people share this information? This is very, very personal, right? So if you're helping kids apply to college, or if your children are in that place, there are schools that are more comfortable. And I have a few resources I'll share at the end. They can write about this in college essays if they think it's appropriate, if it seems like it demonstrates positive characteristics. That's what I really do. That's my regular job, is I help students who are applying to college, and I do professional development for counselors who work with students to help teach them how to teach college essay writing. There's other aspects of college application process. There are letters of recommendation. There's an additional information section. There are, why do you want to come to our college? It may be because there's a gender inclusive living and learning community. It may be because there's clearly opportunities for queer students. There are professors who are out. There are all kinds of things that might make somewhere comfortable for a student. What about work? Will they feel comfortable being themselves? You're helping students, you're helping young people transition into the world. We want to make sure that they're going places that are going to be welcoming and open to them, where they don't have to be explaining and defending themselves or pretending. So does the workplace show any indication that it's not only tolerant but welcoming? You can look for things like, the types of conversations, the pronouns, that they even talk about it. Many places won't. But it's important to know, to not ignore this as just as if somebody needed accommodations for reading or mobility, you wouldn't think twice about asking. So as appropriate and as comfortable, it's important to feel it out, so that our young people don't feel like they're on their own, or that they're being ungrateful because the situation is uncomfortable for them. So we're talking about college. These are the things that, according to Campus Pride, which is an organization, that they say are the 10 top criteria that LGBTQ students look for. Student organizations, students who are out, faculty and staff who are out, inclusive policies, visible signs of pride. So that there's flags or symbols or offices, there's things that they can see, things in windows, things available, important events, that there are allies from the very top down, so it's clear that there are people advocating for them. Inclusive housing, which includes gender neutral bathrooms. I don't even want to get into bathroom discussions. I think it's the most ridiculous thing in the world. Everybody should just be able to use the bathroom. An established center for LGBTQ center of some sort. Is there a major or minor in queer studies? Because a lot of schools have it. And just a general liberal attitude, a vibrant social scene. It doesn't have to be everything on every campus, but these are the kinds of things, again, signals that a campus could be a comfortable place. So where do you get more information? Well, okay, so some of these are mostly educational resources. Campus Pride, they support programs on campuses. There's something called the Safe Zone Project, which is an online resource for training and awareness. So if you want to learn more. GLSEN, which is for schools K-12. So if you're ever looking for curriculum, definitions, amazing. So I said I have a link on my personal email to send me an email, and I'll send it back and you'll see it, that says she, her, and it's linked to a page, a GLSEN page. I'm missing it. I see that I'm missing a letter in there. The link is correct. It should be GLSEN, but the link is correct. That links to a page they have about why it's important for everyone to include their pronouns, so that someone who needs to share pronouns that you might not expect doesn't feel uncomfortable because they've already seen it. And you are free to contact me, questions, additional issues, read my blog. If you look at, you hear about my family from 10 years ago if you want. But if you want to read about gender and my journey as a parent dealing with gender, if you do susanknoppow.wordpress.com/category/gender, that will take you to the section. I mean, you can also sort like on any blog. So before we go to questions, let's practice. I want to talk specifically about non-binary. So the question people will often say is, how does this work? Do I say they is on their way or they are on their way? Easy. We use the pronoun that matches the verb. Is Scooby-Doo coming down for dinner? Tell them we're eating in 10 minutes. What is SpongeBob studying these days? I hear they have started reading the Iliad in the original Greek. Not they is reading, they are reading. Minnie Mouse stopped by for tea yesterday. Their friends showed up too. We talked politics. You match the pronoun to the verb, always. It may sound funny to talk about a single person as they, but they are doesn't sound funny to your ears. So why do I make a big deal about this? Why do I end with they and them pronouns? Because this is really symbolic and it's an illustration of how we can retrain ourselves to think differently about gender. So we might say, well, what difference does it make? Why do we have to do this? We have to practice because when it matters, we want to get it right for the people we care about. Thank you very, very much. And I will be more than happy to take questions for the rest of our time together.
Thank you so much, Susan. There was a lot of information there that I'm sure people are processing, but very helpful. So there's a few questions that came in. And you mentioned about sharing this information with your family. Did you get permission or have a discussion with your child before sharing the information with your family and friends?
Yeah, that is such a good question. So I said this is true for 2 of my children. For one of them, I wrote a lot about what my experience when Miriam first came out, my oldest, who's 22 now, and it's been about 4 or 5 years. I showed them everything I wrote. I talked to them about what I was sharing with family and friends, and they really appreciated that. That was a conversation we had often. And as I explained to them, and I think I said here also, I'm telling my story. I'm not telling their story. I'm telling my story, my experience. And one of the things that was challenging for me at the beginning was I kept looking for stuff. Like, oh, I don't understand this. I need to understand better. And I kept finding things written by 25-year-olds saying, oh, just get over it, figure it out. You'll be okay. And I thought, no. I need the thing written by the 50-year-old mom or dad or the parent who is struggling with this. So it's interesting because those are the emails I get now from parents who say, thank you for writing from a parent's perspective. I want to be supportive and I'm not always sure how. So one of the ways to be supportive is to talk to my child. My youngest, no, don't write about me. Don't talk about me. I mean, it's not a secret. Their trans identity, she's very proud of it and is an activist and is very out about it. But I try hard not to make as big a deal about it. I will mention, her as her in things I write and in conversation, which is her level of comfort with it. So that's a very good question. Yeah, depends on the kid. Like with anything, you want to share what your child is comfortable sharing. Both of my children are very proudly out and public about their gender, but they have different levels of comfort with what I write and talk about in specific.
I think that's a great point. You really have to take into consideration the personality of your child as well, not just if they're transgender or not.
Yeah.
So we have some other questions here. So one of them is related to district policies. So what are policies districts have where you can see an update that needs to happen to be inclusive?
Wait, what are
So I guess the question really is how do you know if an update needs to happen, and maybe how do you go about doing that?
Okay, so I would say that GLSEN, GLSEN.org, start there because they have tons of resources and are likely to have, here's how you know that you have an inclusive district. Here's what you can do in your school or organization. There are things, if I'll give you an example, bathrooms, for example. So in we have a public school district that all my children went to high school. There is a gender neutral bathroom, which is great, but you have to get the key from the secretary in order to use it. And while the school's not huge, it's big enough that if you're not near her office, and she doesn't ask any questions, it's just hanging on a hook. Anyone can take it. You don't need permission. But so it's like sort of inclusive, but it's not totally inclusive. What would be more inclusive is if there were gender neutral bathrooms throughout the school and there was no big deal if anybody used them. If anyone could play, depending on the regulations for your sports districts or whatever, that anyone could play whatever sport by their identity. So things like that. But I would start with GLSEN because they focus specifically on K through 12 education.
Is it okay for someone to not have any pronouns?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never heard of that, but if someone said they don't, I guess you would just have to use their name all the time, which you could. It's a little awkward, but it could happen. So if it's an actual example, if someone says, I know someone who says I don't use any pronouns, then you have to honor that. I've had people say, well, I feel uncomfortable with the pronouns, so I'm just not going to use them. And I say, yeah, try doing that for an entire conversation. It gets really clumsy and it's obvious. Your discomfort is obvious when people do that.
And you don't get to practice that way. So.
Exactly.
Can you speak about gender fluidity and how that fits into the various terms you've gone over?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar, gender fluidity means that things change. So there are people who identify as gender fluid, and that also can mean many different things. For some people, sometimes they identify as female, sometimes they identify as male, or sometimes they identify along a continuum. People want to point to a spot and say, you're here, you're here. So I'll use an example, not from gender, but from sexuality. You may find someone, or celebrities, this will happen, and say, well, I was married to a man and now I'm married to a woman. And they'll say, what, are you gay now? And they'll say, no, I'm attracted to all sorts of people. I was in love with this man and we got married and then we divorced. And then I fell in love with this woman, or I fell in love with this non-binary person, or I fell in love with this trans person. That's fluid sexuality. So gender fluidity means here's how I identify at different times. For some people, it changes a lot. For some people, they say, I'm gender fluid. I don't want you to really nail me down. Please use they and them pronouns. And I don't really want to call myself masculine or feminine, male or female. So it can mean a lot of things. And again, my rule of thumb is if somebody is comfortable enough to tell you about their gender, then you need to be respectful enough to accept it. One of the things I say often to older people, I've done this presentation for people like, retirees, they're 70, they're 80, and I say, you don't have to get it, you don't have to like it, but you still have to do it.
I love that. Thank you for saying that. Is being non-binary and queer the same thing?
Good question. So non-binary is a category of being transgender. Remember, I said there's cisgender, which means your biological sex matches your gender identity. There's transgender when your biological sex does not match your gender identity. Queer is a term that's really been sort of, re-adopted That means in any way, shape, or form, either in gender or sexuality, not straight or cisgender. So if I, and this is me, true Susan Knoppow, I identify as female, I was assigned female at birth, I identify as female, I identify as straight, I have a husband, I'm like, whatever, all the things that you might expect from looking at me. So I would say I am cisgender and straight. Anyone who is either transgender or gay could consider themselves queer. So it's a blanket term for gender and sexuality.
So should we call everyone they, since we should not assume their identity?
Yes. So I have taught myself, that's such a good question. I have taught myself when I see a child walking down the street, I do this out of respect for my children, but because I've done it so much, I realize that it's become more natural to me. I'll say, oh, look at that little kid. They've got the cutest boots on. I try really hard not to assume, because people look, especially at my oldest, at Miriam, and they think female. That's what they look like. They're not particularly like frilly girly, but they look female. And it's uncomfortable to them that everybody assumes that until they've met them or, identified their pronouns. So the funny thing is, so I'm a writer, right? And for our college essay business, my business partner and I wrote 3 books. We have one for counselors, one for parents, one for students about writing college essays. And in the first version of our first book, the one for parents, we thought we're so open, she or he, students, boys and girls, whatever. And then the second edition of it, we said, let's see if we can get rid of those. This was around the time that Miriam was starting to be more out, and we were thinking a lot about pronouns. We managed to write the entire book. I think the only times we referred to people as male or female is if they were. So I'm writing an example about Allison. She wrote her essay about X. I'm writing this example about Danny. He wrote his essay about Y. But when I talk about, we say parents, you really need to help your children, help your child. They may not know what to write about, but you can be supportive. So we learn to use they in the absence of knowing exactly what someone's gender is. And again, that's a signal, because someone to whom that matters will hear that and say, you get it. Thank you. I can feel more comfortable with you.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that took practice.
Mm-hmm,
it is
exactly.
Something that might not come natural, but definitely with practice, It becomes easier. And also looking back, like you did, you can notice how you could work on that and change things.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So someone's asking here, for parents of non-gender conforming students heading off to college, how do they ask for housing and bathrooms for trans non-binary students, or do they just request a single?
Well, that's a good question. So a lot of universities now have gender inclusive housing. And that is something that is worth researching when students are looking into colleges. It is just as important as many other factors. Yes, a single partially solves that problem. I know that schools that have gender inclusive housing will make it available to whoever needs it. And you don't have to bring your credentials to bring your gender nonconforming credentials and prove that you need it. It's generally available to those who are, clearly identify as trans or are questioning or are not, are gender nonconforming in one way or another, which is a term I haven't used yet. But yes, that means that they don't go with the actual, the binary that we assume from birth. If that's not available on a campus, it is worth considering if it's the right school, because that is something that can become really onerous to a young person, to be on a campus that doesn't provide any kind of resources. Because often a campus that has gender inclusive housing will also have gender neutral restrooms and buildings, will have more resources. And it's a sign that they're paying attention, especially now. 5 years ago, maybe not, but now a lot more places offer that.
And I think that's definitely that should be part of the research when they're looking at colleges or looking
For
for
sure.
or programs.
Yeah.
So this is a question, very interesting. How do you deal with people that feel the need to associate body parts with gender? So the person that's asking has a student that is transgender, but is always asked by family members about her plans for her anatomy. So this really upsets her, and it's just a delicate situation. So any guidance there?
Yeah, suggestions here, absolutely. First of all, the first person who should speak to the person who is asking the inappropriate questions ideally should be somebody else. So if someone were doing that for my child, ideally I would be the one to go to them and say, please don't do that. We also though have to teach, and young people have to learn how to shut people up without seeming, well, I wouldn't say without seeming rude, because it's, it is actually their rude question. So we have to say, why do I have to be nice to them if they're asking me a rude question? The answer to that is, I don't talk about my anatomy, do you? It's sort of a like, really? Would you like to talk about it? Because it may seem like an off-putting response, but it's a completely appropriate response, because that's voyeurism. It's nobody's business. And I think it's important, while I don't advocate for fighting, I think there are times when it's important to show somebody through our response that their curiosity is completely inappropriate. It's none of their business, anything about it. And it's none of my business what's under their clothes either.
I think that's a great point. I think that people are curious and they just don't know how to ask appropriate questions and how to be respectful of that other person. It's almost this boundary that they cross that they don't realize they're crossing.
Exactly. And unfortunately, one of the ways to show them that they're crossing it is to embarrass them a little bit. Sometimes
that always
it's necessary.
works. Exactly. So I wanted to just mention that there are a few people that are sharing resources in the questions and in the chats. So I will be providing that in our follow-up email, because there's some great resources there. And I know that some people are asking for the slides as well. So if that's something that we can include as well. But I think that there's so much great information. I think it's also important to say that this is evolving. In a year or two from now, there may be new information. And I think that it's really, our responsibility to be current with this information and to educate ourselves and to be respectful. And like you said before, it's not for us to judge or to accept or not accept. It's more a matter of us to be respectful, even if we can't wrap our heads around it, and to show that we're trying and that we have that unconditional love for that person and that we can respect others, even if we can't understand it.
And if you can engage, if you are a person who can engage, step a little out of your comfort zone and engage. Tell somebody who might not get it. Practice being an advocate, not just a supporter. That makes a big difference.
Yes, and it's one of the reasons why I loved your presentation so much when I saw it originally, and why I wanted to share it with our community, because I feel your message and your perspective as a parent will really speak to a lot of our audience. Because as a parent, we try to do the best we can with what we know, but what we don't know, we don't know. So hopefully this will help for the future and help parents out there that may be curious or struggling or just not sure the best way to go about it. So I really appreciate your graciousness with all your knowledge and experience. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And we hope that you join us next time. And thank you so much, Susan, for such a wonderful webinar.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.